In this video, we're going to talk about GoldenEye, the introduction of the Pierce Brosnan era of James Bond. This is a movie where Bond bungees off a huge dam, where he chases an airplane off a cliff, gets in, and flies away in it. The movie where he drives a tank through the streets of St. Petersburg, and the movie where he doesn't know if he's fighting the femme fatale or making love to her. This is a movie where Pierce Brosnan finally gets to don the mantle of 007, and he's fantastic. And this is the moment where fans consider James Bond to have entered the modern age. If Sean Connery and George Lazenby represent the golden age of 007 in the 60s, then Roger Moore and Timothy Dalton represent Bond in the silver age of the 1970s and 1980s. And Pierce Brosnan and Daniel Craig represent Bond in modern times. So immediately after License to Kill, Eon and MGM UA began pre-production on the 17th Bond film and their third Timothy Dalton 007 movie. However, MGM wanted to take James Bond into the modern era, and they worried that screenwriter Richard Maibaum and director John Glenn were too stuck in the past. And that's a crazy bold statement, but also a little hard to argue against. Richard Maibaum was there from the beginning and had written 12 screenplays for James Bond, including Dr. No, For Much With Love, Goldfinger, Thunderball, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, The Man with the Golden Gun, The Spy Who Loved Me, For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, A View to a Kill, The Living Daylights, and had even started work on License to Kill. And John Glenn was instrumental in defining James Bond for the 1980s and brought Generation X to the Bond franchise. John Glenn had started as an editor and second unit director for On Her Majesty's Secret Service and had directed For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, A View to a Kill, The Living Daylights, and License to Kill. But MGM really wanted to go in a new direction for the Bond franchise and try to appeal to a whole new, younger demographic. Shortly thereafter, Richard Maibaum in 1991 passed away at the age of 81, and as for John Glenn, he would go on to direct the 1992 film Christopher Columbus, The Discovery, the one without Gerard Depardieu. But what did it mean for MGM to go into the modern era and appeal to a younger demographic? Well, it turned out that a survey that MGM did discovered that most teenagers in 1990 did not know who James Bond was, and those that knew associated with him as a character that their fathers liked. The younger generation preferred action movies like Die Hard, Commando, Terminator, Batman, or Indiana Jones, not the James Bond movies, and MGM wanted to change that and bring James Bond to appeal to that new, younger audience. So screenwriters William Osborne and William Davies, the two had written Stop or My Mom Will Shoot for Sylvester Stallone and Twins for Arnold Schwarzenegger, they wrote a story about Bond going up against a Hong Kong industrialist named Sir Henry Ferguson, who teams up with a Chinese general to take over mainland China and Hong Kong. And this movie would have had Bond going to Vancouver, then Las Vegas, then Hong Kong and China. Cubby Broccoli began pre-production on the third Timothy Dalton James Bond film, and they were in search of a director, and one of the directors they were looking at was John Landis. John Landis was primarily known as a comedic director, directing Animal House, Blues Brothers, Trading Places, Coming to America, but showed his versatility in directing An American Werewolf in London. And then some legal drama occurred. In 1991, an Australian financing company known as Quintex was trying to purchase MGM UA for the price of $1.5 billion. However, at the last minute, Quintex could not raise the money and the purchase fell through. But MGM UA was vulnerable, and then suddenly an Italian financing company called Pathé, owned by Giancarlo Peretti, jumped in and tried a hostile takeover of MGM UA for the price of $1.2 billion. And there were rumors that Giancarlo Peretti was somewhat of a shady businessman. Peretti had just taken over Cannon Films, yes, the Cannon Films, who had made Bloodsport, Break-In and Break-In 2 Electric Boogaloo, Masters of the Universe, and Superman 4 Quest for Peace. Peretti took over Cannon from Menachem Golem and Yoram Globus and changed the name of Cannon Films to Pathé Communications. And he wanted to take over MGM UA. Apparently, Peretti was allegedly known for bank fraud and writing bad checks in Europe, although I can't verify this, but some online news sites accuse him of this. Well, Giancarlo Peretti did not have $1.2 billion, but he had a very shady plan to come up with the money for the merger. And his plan was that even before owning MGM UA, he began to go to various broadcasting companies and sell off the broadcasting rights to the MGM UA library. And with that money, he used it to make a down payment on the $1.2 billion. And it sounds blatantly corrupt to me, but that's exactly what he did. And Peretti's ultimate goal may have been to fully acquire the MGM UA library, which was worth far more than $1.2 billion, and sell them off piece by piece and making a hefty profit. And one of the deals that Peretti made was to Ted Turner, who began running James Bond films on his TNT network without permission from Eon Films. Peretti did not quite own MGM yet, so he really didn't have the right to be doing this. And even if he did, Cubby Broccoli owned half the James Bond franchise, and Peretti didn't consult nor pay Broccoli to do this. One day, Cubby Broccoli is watching TV and he sees that Ted Turner is airing his James Bond movies. And through this shady trick, he was briefly able to take over and own MGM, which he renamed MGM Pathé. And Peretti would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for that pesky Cubby Broccoli. Cubby Broccoli sued Peretti and stopped the merger. Giancarlo Peretti countersued, and it was an ugly court battle that was able to tie up this merger in courts long enough that the suit eventually joined by Blake Edwards. And this is also because the two major MGM UA films that were being aired were the James Bond films and the Pink Panther movies. And Blake Edwards had created the Pink Panther. The combined lawsuits was able to tie up the merger in court. And in 1993, Peretti went bankrupt. And then a French bank, Credit Lyonnais, acquired MGM Pathé Communications and renamed the company back to MGM. And with Cubby Broccoli, began production on the next James Bond movie. Incidentally, in 1999, Giancarlo Peretti was found guilty of misuse of corporate funds and fraud and was sentenced to 4 years in prison by a Paris court. Cubby Broccoli went to Timothy Dalton for Bond 17, and Timothy Dalton was interested in the role. However, his original 3-picture contract had just expired, so Cubby Broccoli said that since there was a long gap since the last movie, they would have to make a few more movies to reestablish Dalton as Bond, and insisted that Timothy Dalton sign another 5-year, maybe possibly a 3 to 4 film contract, and Timothy Dalton was not interested in playing Bond for that long. In other words, it was possibly a dance of negotiations. Well, that dance fell through, and Timothy Dalton walked away from the role. However, in a 2015 interview with Alan Ladd Jr., he said that in reality, MGM wanted to get rid of Timothy Dalton and go in a new direction, but Eon really liked him, and they let him have the story that he walked away so that he can save face and still salvage his movie career. Timothy Dalton was on the set of the TV movie Scarlet, where he was starring as Rhett Butler on the sequel to Gone with the Wind, and on April 11, 1994, he officially announced that he was resigning from the role of James Bond. For the screenwriter of Bond 17, Michael France, who had written Cy Salone's Cliffhanger, wrote a draft of the script that would address the relevancy of Bond in the post-Cold War age. In Michael France's script, he created a character named Augustus Trevelyan, who was James Bond's mentor and superior at MI6, who defected to the Soviet Union. And the film involved a satellite that delivered a powerful electromagnetic pulse, and there was a scene where Bond, in his Aston Martin, would drive the car inside a high-speed train. Then another screenwriter, Jeffrey Caine, revised Michael France's script and tightened up the narrative and structure of the story. And he made Augustus Trevelyan a fellow 00 agent of Bond, who Bond thought was dead, but was in hiding as a Russian gangster. Bruce Feirstein came in and made final revisions to the script. And Feirstein was a famous comedic writer who in 1981 had written the immensely popular satirical book Real Men Don't Eat Quiche, which had spent over 55 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and penetrated the zeitgeist of the nation at the time. And those from my generation likely remember this book. And for those that actually read it, the entire first chapter is about how every man desires to be James Bond. And no doubt this is what attracted Eon to hire Bruce Feirstein. For the director, they offered the film to Hong Kong action star John Woo, who turned it down to make Broken Arrow, but was very honored by the offer. And the very next year, he would go on to make Face Off. They also offered it to Rennie Harlin, who had just made Die Hard 2, but he turned it down so that he could make Cutthroat Island with his then-wife, Gina Davis, the one that would bankrupt their studio. So the job went to New Zealand director Martin Campbell, who was primarily a television director at the time, and he did a few B-list movies, but this was going to be his first major Hollywood motion picture, and he'll be the first non-Brit to direct a James Bond film in the history of the 007 franchise. And from here, he's going to become a superstar director. Next, he'll direct the 1998 film Mask of Zorro, and in 2005, The Legend of Zorro, and in 2006 he'll direct the amazing Daniel Craig debut, Casino Royale. Incidentally, he'll also go on to direct Green Lantern with Ryan Reynolds, but I'll try not to hold that against him. One of the things that Martin Campbell added to his James Bond story was that James Bond never smokes. Remember, Sean Connery's Bond smoked cigarettes, but Roger Moore's Bond was made to smoke cigars to differentiate himself from Sean Connery's Bond, although they did eventually drop that trait. However, Timothy Dalton's Bond also smoked cigarettes in order to resemble the Bond of the novels. However, Martin Campbell hated smoking and made Bond completely smokeless. Now, at this time when Eon was casting for a new James Bond, I'm sure everyone assumed that Pierce Brosnan would be the next Bond. But Ralph Fiennes, Liam Neeson, and Hugh Grant, as well as several others, were considered before the role officially was given to Pierce Brosnan.
You were expecting someone else?
We all know that Pierce Brosnan was offered the role in 1987, and back then he was a relative unknown, having just starred in one TV series, Remington Steele. Well, now he was a veteran movie star, having starred in a dozen major motion pictures, including The Fourth Protocol and the miniseries James Clavell's Noble House. He also starred in the cult classic The Lawnmower Man and the widely successful Robin Williams vehicle, Mrs. Doubtfire. So in 1994, he was a bona fide movie star. Pierce Brosnan was born on May 16, 1953 in Drogheda, Ireland, and when he was a baby, his father left the mother, so his mother had to move to England to work as a nurse. And so Pierce was raised by his grandparents. And when he was 11, he moved to Scotland to join his mother and her new husband, who introduced Pierce Brosnan to the James Bond movies. And Pierce Brosnan became a huge fan of James Bond. They soon moved to London, and Pierce attended the St. Martin's School of Art in London to become a painter and commercial illustrator. But while in school, he found acting, and he decided to become an actor. He joined the Drama Centre of London, and afterwards had bit parts in several TV shows. And in 1981, Pierce Brosnan was married to Cassandra Harris, who played Countess Liesel in For Your Eyes Only. And Cassandra Harris wanted her husband to play James Bond and brought him to the set. And while Brosnan visited her, Cubby Broccoli met with him and was fascinated with him and took Pierce and Cassandra Harris out to lunch. And after the meal, he is said to have said, "If he can act, he's my Bond." Sadly, Cassandra Harris passed away from cancer in 1991, and Pierce Brosnan stayed at her side the entire time and even adopted her children from a previous marriage. So he is a total class act. Pierce Brosnan was then hired for the role of Remington Steele, which ran for 4 seasons, and in 1986, when they were casting for The Living Daylights, Cubby Broccoli wanted Timothy Dalton, but he was busy filming Brenda Starr. So they auditioned many actors, and Pierce Brosnan, who was a diehard James Bond fan, was perfect, and he was cast in the role of James Bond. Now, Remington Steele had just been canceled, although they had 60 days to pick up the show. And Eon announced that Pierce Brosnan was cast as James Bond. They did costume fittings, promotional stills, and press releases. And unfortunately, this announcement as James Bond caused a lot of fans to go back and watch reruns of Remington Steele. And this new interest in Remington Steele caused NBC to renew Remington Steele for another season. But Cubby Broccoli really wanted Pierce Brosnan to be Bond, so he negotiated a deal where Brosnan could be in 6 episodes of Remington Steele and still be in the Bond movie, but NBC got greedy and insisted on a full 22-episode season. And this caused Pierce Brosnan to lose out on the role of James Bond, with Cubby Broccoli saying, "Remington Steele will not be James Bond, and James Bond will not be Remington Steele." Sadly, with Pierce Brosnan no longer being James Bond, interest in Remington Steele dropped. The series was canceled forever without shooting any episodes, and so Pierce Brosnan lost out on both James Bond and Remington Steele. One of the fans of James Bond who was devastated that Pierce Brosnan didn't get the role of Bond in 1987 was director Chris Columbus. He thought Pierce Brosnan would have made the perfect Bond, so in 1991 when he was casting for the role of Stu in Mrs. Doubtfire, he cast Pierce Brosnan for the role. And on set, Chris Columbus told Pierce Brosnan what a great Bond he would have made and recommend that he never give up on trying. And in 1995, MGM actually called Chris Columbus and informed him that they were considering hiring Pierce Brosnan for the role of James Bond and called to ask what it was like working with him. And Chris Columbus gave a strong, glowing recommendation and told MGM what a nice guy he was and how professional and easy to work with Pierce Brosnan was on the set. So Pierce Brosnan was cast and he was paid a salary of $4 million. And he would go on to make a total of $41 million for all 4 of his James Bond films. So that's not bad. The title of the movie was announced as GoldenEye, And this is the first James Bond movie not based on an Ian Fleming story. And this is the second film after License to Kill that is not named after an Ian Fleming novel title. Now, GoldenEye is named after Ian Fleming's beach house in Jamaica, where he wrote all of the Bond novels from 1952 to 1964. The phrase GoldenEye is apparently a reference to a British Secret Service operation that Ian Fleming himself was a part of during World War II, where he served as military intelligence officer, and it was actually the contingency plan that the SIS had in case the Nazis invaded Spain. This movie will be the final James Bond film that Albert Cubby Broccoli saw, and I imagine that he must have been very happy that his franchise was in good hands. This will also be the first film where his daughter, Barbara Broccoli, will come on as full producer along with her half-brother Michael G. Wilson, who had produced and co-written every James Bond movie since The Spy Who Loved Me. For the role of 006, originally this part was going to go to an older actor who was supposed to be more of a mentor than a contemporary, and you can see the true subtext then, and they wanted Anthony Hopkins to play Alec Trevelyan, but he declined. Incidentally, Anthony Hopkins would go on to play the older Zorro in director Martin Campbell's next movie, the older Zorro who mentors the younger new Zorro, so you can see the connection there. Sean Bean, who had auditioned for the role of James Bond in The Living Daylights, was cast in the role. For the role of Xenia Onatopp, the producers originally wanted Courtney Cox, and I cannot see that at all. However, she turned it down to star in this new sitcom called Friends. Famke Janssen was hired for Onatopp when Martin Campbell saw her in the early dailies of the 1995 film Lord of Illusions. And Famke Janssen is Dutch and attended the University of Amsterdam and majored in economics, and then enrolled in Columbia University and studied literature. And at age 20, she became a model and worked for Yves Saint Laurent, Giorgio Armani, Chanel, and Victoria's Secret, and at 26 entered acting. And one of her first roles was in the 5th season of Star Trek The Next Generation, the episode The Perfect Mate. And later that year, she was offered the role of Jadzia Dax in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, but declined it in order to pursue a movie career. For the role of computer nerd Natalya Simonova, the filmmakers wanted Paulina Porskova, who was an incredibly popular supermodel in the 1980s. However, Paulina declined, and the role eventually went to Isabella Scoruppo. And Isabella Scoruppo was born in Poland, but grew up in Stockholm, Sweden. And she traveled through Europe working as a model, and in 1987 starred in her first Swedish film, Nobody Can Love Like Us. And in 1990 had a brief career as a pop singer, and her first album was certified gold in Sweden. Now, GoldenEye was to be her big break in American films, but that didn't exactly happen, but she continues to act in many Swedish films. Now, for the role of M, the producers wanted to do something different, like make M a woman. And when MGM heard that Ian was looking for a female to be cast as M, the studio's heads of MGM called and said, "You better hire Judi Dench." And so Martin Campbell called Judi Dench and made her an offer. And she was hesitant at first, but her entire family, including her husband, insisted she take the role. And her husband even joked that he always wanted to be married to a Bond girl. Barbara Broccoli, Michael G. Wilson, and Martin Campbell wanted to do something very special for the opening of the movie. Something that would set the tone for the new modern direction of not only this movie, but the entire franchise. Something that would razzle-dazzle the new younger generation. And that was the bungee jump. And this bungee jump was filmed at the Contra Dam in Ticino, Switzerland. And this stunt was done by stuntman Wayne Michaels, who was a minor stuntman on the Eon team and did background stunts in For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, A View to a Kill, and The Living Daylights. But this will be his first big stunt for the James Bond movies. And the jump would be 722 feet, which was the highest anyone had ever bungee jumped before. And the stunt took 2 weeks to prepare for, and even though the preparations didn't exactly go as planned, stuntman Wayne Michaels decided to go for it anyway. However, Michaels was worried that the drop would cause him to pass out at the end. However, he knew that during the jump, he had to pull out a grappling gun for the shot. And this involved taking the gun out of its holster while he was plummeting 720 feet toward the ground. So Wayne Michaels focused all of his attention and effort on taking out the gun of the holster and aiming it. And sure enough, he completed the shot successfully. And also sure enough, he did pass out at the end of the jump. However, they got the shot in one take. And Wayne Michaels was uninjured, and it would go on to be the stunt that opened up and defined the Brosnan era of Bond. Now, some sources claim that they actually did 2 jumps, but in interviews with the cast and crew, they claimed that it was only 1 jump. Now, the largest stunt sequence in the film was the tank chase through the streets of St. Petersburg, and this sequence took around 6 weeks to film. Originally, they actually considered filming this in St. Petersburg, but the Russian government made too many demands on the Eon crew. Therefore, the production crew actually built a replica of St. Petersburg on the back lot of Leavesden Studios in Hertfordshire. Interestingly, they couldn't film at Pinewood Studios, their own 007 Cubby Broccoli studio, because it was fully booked at the time filming the 1995 film First Night, starring Sean Connery as King Arthur. The crew spent $1 million to build a replica of St. Petersburg that the tank could plow through and destroy. And for the tank itself, a Russian T-55 tank was on loan from the East England Military Museum. And filming the sequence in England ultimately ended up saving the crew much time, money, and a lot of headaches. However, for the long shot of the tank in St. Petersburg, a small second unit team went to St. Petersburg to drive the tank slowly and carefully around the city. In fact, they were so concerned of any damages to the city that the crew even replaced the tank treads of the Russian T-55 with British tank treads, which did not leave tread marks on the streets of St. Petersburg. When the two scenes were merged together, it really looked like a tank was wreaking havoc through the streets of St. Petersburg. In fact, when the movie premiered in Russia, many citizens were outraged and filed complaints with their local government that a tank was allowed to rampage through their city. And the Russians were shocked to discover that most of it was filmed on a studio back lot in England. One of the many ways that the crew were able to save money on the special effects was that they used a ton of miniature models created by Eon regular Derek Meddings. In fact, GoldenEye had more miniature models than any of the previous James Bond films. Among the miniatures used in this movie was most of the external shots of Severnaya base in Siberia, the scene where the three MiGs approach Severnaya and are destroyed. Yeah, that was all miniatures. The scene where the Bond's tank crashes into Janus' train, miniatures. And the round lake which hides the satellite dish, that was also a miniature, and the satellite dish at the finale of the movie. These were all miniatures, and I had no idea they were miniatures, and even when I watch the movie now knowing that they're miniatures, I have a hard time believing it because they look so good. And Derek Meddings began his career working for Jerry Anderson, including the Thunderbird series. He then started working for Cubby Broccoli when he made some miniatures for Live and Let Die, and he was rehired for The Man with the Golden Gun, and then returned for The Spy Who Loved Me, and he created the Lotus that turns into a submarine, and then created the miniatures for the supertanker and the nuclear submarine. And then he created most of the optical effects for Moonraker, convincing the world that James Bond really did go to space. Derek Meddings also worked on the Superman series and created the Krypton miniatures as well as the Golden Gate Bridge. But sadly, GoldenEye will be his last film, because he died in 1995 from colorectal cancer at the age of 64. And like all Bond movies, this film starts with a gun barrel sequence, but this time the gun barrel sequence was made with CGI, which as you see allowed for a more realistic texture change inside the gun barrel. And the movie's going to start with an incredible stunt, but the first shot is an airplane, which will pay off later in the sequence. So the film opens up with a huge dam, and we see a man in a black outfit running to the center of the dam, and we don't see his face yet, but at the bottom of the dam, we see a point where he's going to land, and then the camera pans up, and it pans up, and the camera just keeps panning up, and we realize that Bond is going to bungee down this insane height. Pause for a moment, and then he dives, and it's a great first shot. And the actual jump, 722 feet, set the Guinness Book of World Record for the highest bungee jump ever. And mid-jump, he calmly pulls out his gun and harpoon guns the bottom of the dam, and you have to give credit to stuntman Wayne Michaels for his composure in pulling out the gun during this crazy drop. It's a spectacular start of the movie. And he's going to get an upgrade here as not only the main stuntman, as well as a nice upgrade where he has a minor speaking role playing Captain Bernard Jobert, the French Tiger helicopter pilot, the one who gets killed by Xenia Onatopp. Then Bond rappels down into the bathroom, and hanging upside down, we sort of get a tease of his first appearance. But then we get the full view. Pierce Brosnan holding a gun in that classic Bond pose, and he looks great. He looks better than Timothy Dalton, looks better than Roger Moore, and based on his looks, I would say he looks better than Sean Connery. He's insanely handsome, and he's clearly the best looking Bond yet. But can he deliver the goods in his acting? So he runs into 006, Sean Bean, who is now known as Ned Stark. Before that, he was Boromir, and here he plays Bond's predecessor and mentor, Alec Trevelyan. And you see the symbolism. new Bond versus old Bond. And Sean Bean with his lighter colored hair has a passing resemblance to Roger Moore, and he even says the classic line associated with Roger Moore,
"For England."
But James, I need you.
So does England.
So we get the metatextual reference of old Bond mentoring new Bond. 006 and 007 set up explosives to destroy the hideout inside the dam. And I love the way Pierce Brosnan moves here. He's got confidence, he's got swagger, but he also has a cold ruthlessness as well as lightning swift athleticism that's been missing in all the previous James Bond films. In fact, Pierce Brosnan did many of the stunts himself and almost did all of the fight scenes himself, and it shows in this more convincing performance. 006 is captured by the commanding officer of the facility, Colonel Arkady Grigorovich Ourumov, and Ourumov shoots and kills him, or so we think. The Soviet soldiers are circling Bond and he hides behind this explosive gas canister, and the Russians can't shoot because if they do, they're going to blow up everyone in the room. And if there's the old classic Bond, we might have gotten a James Bond one-liner, but I like that this modern Bond has more modern writing, because instead of a one-liner, we get the wheels that are squeaking. And it's funny, and there's humor, but the humor is more subtle. And when one of the soldiers nervously fires at Bond, risking an explosion, Colonel Ourumov shoots him. And this was inspired by the 1969 Western film, The Wild Bunch. Bond then shoots a latch out the gas canisters, and it's a visually amazing scene where it rains gas canisters on the Russian troops. And Bond makes his escape and goes outside, where he catches up to an airplane about to take off. However, both he and the pilot fall out of the plane, and as the plane goes off a cliff, Bond jumps on a motorcycle and rides off the cliff after the airplane, catches up to the falling plane, gets in, and pilots away safely using the plane as the explosives destroy the base. It's a crazy opening sequence, and it tells you exactly what kind of movie you're in and what kind of movies we're going to get with the Pierce Brosnan James Bond films. And I am totally on board. And then we get this movie's opening montage. And this was the first montage that was not done by Maurice Binder, who had created all the musical montages since Dr. No. In fact, Maurice Binder actually came up with the gun barrel sequence. Maurice Binder, after 16 films, passed away in 1991 from lung cancer at the age of 65. GoldenEye's opening montage was created by Daniel Kleinman, and this opening montage actually tells a story. The pre-credit action sequence supposedly takes place 9 years earlier when the Soviet Union was at its peak, and the movie proper starts after the fall of the Soviet Union, so the music montage fills in the gaps and tells us about the fall of the Soviet Union. And for the song GoldenEye, it was written by Bono and The Edge, aka David Howell Evans, and the song was performed by Tina Turner. However, because Bono wrote the song independently of the producers, the lyrics to the song have nothing to do with the movie. And furthermore, because the producers didn't collaborate with Bono or The Edge, the musical melody of the song is never used throughout the movie, as was a custom for James Bond musical songs. However, it's a great song and is considered a fan favorite. Now keep in mind, this movie was originally written for Timothy Dalton, but I feel it's already a different movie because Brosnan just oozes swagger, and he has a smirk on his face that says, "I'm having a great time." And Pierce Brosnan has the confidence of Sean Connery, he has the suave sophistication of Roger Moore, and yet has the cold dark edge of Timothy Dalton. I think Pierce Brosnan is a great James Bond. However, 007 fans may argue that he had the disadvantage of being in some of the weaker films of the franchise. We start the movie proper 9 years later after the pre-credit sequence, and James Bond is driving the classic Aston Martin DB5, and he's riding with a woman who is evaluating him. And I like that this movie starts with the Aston Martin because it's not the car we're going to associate with the Pierce Brosnan Bonds. Sean Connery drove the Aston Martin, Roger Moore drove the Lotus Esprit, and Pierce Brosnan will become associated with the BMW. And then he comes across a red Ferrari F355 driven by the movie's Femme Fatale, played by Famke Janssen, who is probably best known for a role here and for playing Jean Grey in the X-Men movie series. And she is great because she's so beautiful and sexy, but there's this aura of danger all about her. And the two race on this narrow snake-like road playing chicken while Bond's evaluator is freaking out. And Bond is just having a great time. And this scene was filmed by Remy Julien, whose precision stunt team did the car stunts for A View to a Kill and did the final semi-truck scene in License to Kill. And while filming this scene, there was one slip-up where two cars actually crashed into each other, The Ferrari F355 was rented and the crew had to fix the Ferrari overnight at a cost of $80,000. We get a cameo here by director Martin Campbell, and Ferrari allowed the use of their car to be used in this movie on the condition that it would not lose the race, and that is why James Bond stops the race and allows the Ferrari to win. Bond goes to a casino in Monte Carlo, and this was filmed on location in Monte Carlo. And Bond runs into the lady in the red Ferrari while playing Baccarat, or chemin de fer. And Pierce Brosnan finally introduces himself as James Bond.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
And Bond discovers that her name is Xenia Onatopp. And when Bond asks,
On the top?
she answers,
On the top.
and Bond realizes that they're more to her than meets the eye. And that night, Onatopp is making love to a Canadian admiral named Chuck Farrell, and she begins to squeeze her legs and crushes his ribcage, suffocating him to death, while Ormov steals his ID and they're going to replace him with a doppelganger. Bond is authorized to investigate, and he gets on the Canadian yacht to find Admiral Chuck Farrell dead with a huge grin on his face. And Xenia and General Ormov plan to steal the Eurocopter Tiger helicopter, which can withstand an electromagnetic pulse. Maybe they use the microchip designed by Max Zorin. Xenia kills the Tiger helicopter pilots and takes their place, and Bond tries to stop them but is stopped by the French soldiers. The movie goes on to a computer facility in Severnaya in Siberia, and we meet two computer programmers, Natalya Simonova, played by Isabella Scoruppo, and Boris Grishenko, played by Alan Cumming. And we get the feeling that Boris is kind of a loser and maybe a sexual harasser, but we'll later find out that he is also a traitor. Then General Ormov and Xenia arrive at the facility with the Tiger helicopter, and they're working for the Janus syndicate. Janus, aka Janus, the Roman god of two faces. Get it? Two-Face? This is our first hint that they're working with a revived 006. And Xenia takes a machine gun and murders the entire facility, and we see that she's getting turned on by this murder. She is one sick puppy and an intriguing and awesome Bond villain. And even Ormov realizes how sick she is. However, Natalya was not in the programming room because she was on a coffee break and has survived the shooting. Ormov and Xenia have come to the Siberian control room where they plan to take over the GoldenEye satellite, a weapon left over from the Cold War which can shoot an electromagnetic pulse. And they aim their weapon at the Severnaya base and then take off in their EMP immune helicopter. And this is a great sequence where the Russians send 3 MiGs and even they fall to the electromagnetic pulse. And this entire sequence, as great and convincing as it looks, was all done with miniatures, and that is amazing. Bond heads to the new MI6 office, where this is where art and reality merge, because the MI6 office that we see here is the new MI6 SIS building in real life. This new MI6 SIS building is the headquarters building of Britain's Secret Intelligence Service in London and is located at the south bank of the River Thames in Vauxhall, or Vauxhall as it's known in England. And it's a beautiful postmodern building that looks like a work of art. And it was completed in 1994, so Eon decided to similarly make it the movie's MI6 headquarters. And the shot of MI6 used in this movie is the real MI6 headquarters. At MI6, we meet the new Moneypenny, played by Samantha Bond, no relation, and she's going to play Moneypenny in all the Pierce Brosnan films. And she's cute, she's tough, and she has this great chemistry with Pierce Brosnan, bringing back the electric relationship between Sean Connery and Lois Maxwell. During the Roger Moore era, Bond and Moneypenny felt more like brother and sister, while Carolyn Bliss's Moneypenny seemed to have an unrequited crush on Dalton's Bond. But here, the electricity is back, and I love this new relationship.
What would I ever do without you?
As far as I can remember, James, you've never had me.
We then meet Michael Kitchens as Bill Tanner, the chief of staff, who was one of Ian Fleming's original characters in Casino Royale, and made his first movie appearance in The Man with the Golden Gun, played by Michael Goodliff. Then we meet M, and she's played by the incomparable Judi Dench. And this is the first time M is played by a woman, but actually the idea to have a female M was originally suggested by Lois Maxwell, who played Money in the previous movies. And during A View to a Kill, she suggested to have Moneypenny be promoted to M, where she would be Bond's new boss. And I really liked that idea. Now initially, when Judi Dench was cast as M, fans did not react well to the idea of M being a woman. However, the second people saw her performance on screen, all doubts disappeared. Now, it should be mentioned that the actual head of British intelligence, the director of MI5 at the time, was actually a woman. Her name was Stella Remington, who held the top position from 1992 to 1996. So not only is it appropriate for the theme of the film, but it actually reflects real-world events at the time. And Judi Dench is incredible here. She's tough, she oozes charisma, and I get chills every time I hear her talk. And she accuses Bond of being,
"You're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur. A relic of the Cold War."
and with a clear metatextual subtext aimed at the franchise, who many wondered if it was too sexist and misogynistic to be able to successfully market to the younger modern generation who were raised in a period after the Cold War. And what a brilliant solution to the problem. Not only hire a woman to be James Bond's boss, but to call out the problems outright. It was genius, and it worked. And then M has her own Save the Cat moment, where she tells Bond that she has no problem sending him on a life or death mission, but will only do it if it is justified. And then she approves the mission for Bond to investigate. And she tells Bond,
"Come back alive."
and we, the audience, are completely won over by her. And she is totally a sign of the times. She's tough while being feminine, and she's totally believable as MI6's top spy. She's awesome, and it's one of the best things about this movie. So here's something cool. In the script, we get M's real name, and it's never mentioned in the movie, but it's mentioned in the original script. And it was probably a throwaway line, but it's going to become significant since Judi Dench will play M in the next 7 movies. So what is her name? Here we go. Her name is Barbara Maudsley. And here's something even crazier. In the Daniel Craig movies, her name is Olivia Mansfield. The two M's, both played by Judi Dench, are two totally different characters. We also meet Q again, played by Desmond Llewellyn, who is the only actor to be a holdover from the previous movies. And he's sitting down with a cast that turns into a missile, and he gives Bond a pen that is really a grenade, activated by clicking it 3 times, and de-armed by clicking it a 4th time. And we are introduced to Bond's new car, the BMW Z3 Roadster. And this was a new product placement deal that Eon made with BMW, the first German car to have a product placement deal with 007. And it's going to be a huge success. BMW produced 15,000 BMW Z3 Roadsters, and they immediately sold out after the premiere of this movie. In fact, there were rumors that all 15,000 sold out before the release of the movie, just by being associated with James Bond. Then another 21,000 were produced and called the James Bond Edition, and they all sold out within the year. And let's face it, it's a great looking car. However, I think the filmmakers made a huge mistake not to include a car chase in the movie. They introduced a car, but never use it. And of course this was a mistake, because if you introduce a gun in Act 1, it must go off in Act 3. And here the director breaks that cardinal rule, a violation of Chekhov's BMW. Well, the reason why the BMW was not featured in any action car sequences in this movie is actually quite simple and makes a lot of sense. It's because the product placement deal came very late, almost as the movie finished filming, so they couldn't create any major action sequences. Incidentally, the other product placement deals in this movie include Perrier Mineral Water, Omega Watches, IBM Computers, Jack Daniel's Black Label Tennessee Whiskey, and Smirnoff Vodka, among many others. We also meet CIA contact Jack Wade, who is the new Felix Leiter. Because remember, Felix Leiter lost his limbs in the last movie when he was fed to the sharks. Well, this movie keeps up that continuity. But Jack Wade is played by actor Jodan Baker, who also played the villain Brad Whitaker in The Living Daylights. See, Jodan Baker was a good friend of director Martin Campbell and played a similar character in another Martin Campbell film called The Edge of Darkness. So he was the director's top choice to play this character. And Jodan Baker is the 3rd actor to play multiple roles in a James Bond film. Walter Gotell played the villain Morenzi in From Russia with Love and returned to be General Gogol in 5 later movies. And Charles Gray played Henderson in You Only Live Twice, and then Blofeld in Diamonds Are Forever. Now, Jack Wade doesn't really know who Janus is, but he knows that Janus is a Cossack. And the Cossacks are Eastern European Slavic Christian ethnic minority residing roughly between Russia and Ukraine. And a little history here, during World War II, many of the Cossacks, not all, but many, sided with Nazi Germany against the Russians. However, after the Allies defeated Germany, they had captured many Cossacks who are now refugees. However, during the Yalta Conference, Britain and the US decided to repatriate the Cossacks back to the Soviet Union, where most of them were executed or sent to labor camps. It was seen as a huge betrayal of the Cossacks by the British and the US. Jack Wade tells Bond that Janus's main competitor is Valentin Dmitrovich Zhukovsky, an old KGB officer now turned gangster. And he has a past relationship with Bond, because Bond once shot him in the leg and gave him the limp that he has now. Bond meets with Zhukovsky, played by Robbie Coltrane, who is best known for playing Hagrid, and they have a very interesting exchange.
Walther PPK. 7.65 millimeter. Only 3 men I know use such a gun. I believe I've killed 2 of them.
Lucky me.
And in the background is a woman singing Stand By Your Man in a very off-key manner, and the woman is Minnie Driver in one of her first movie roles. And Zhukovsky helps set up a meeting with Bond and Janus. And later that night, Bond is relaxing at a hotel spa, and Xenia is stalking him. And we get one of the coolest fight scenes in the history of the franchise, which is the hot tub battle scene between James Bond and Xenia on a top. And it's really one of the most memorable fight scenes, because we're not really sure if they're fighting or making love, and for a moment we feel that Bond isn't sure either. And there's one scene where he gets up and kindly and calmly walks away and reaches for his gun, and she jumps on him and attacks him from the back. But Bond never loses his cool. And now it's become one of the most memorable fight scenes of the entire James Bond franchise.
No. No more foreplay.
So Bond captures Xenia and makes her take him to Janus. And when they meet, it's Alec Trevelyan, 006. And I had so many questions, because was he always bad? Was he already working with Ormov during the opening action sequence? Then why didn't he just kill Bond when he had the chance? Well, presumably the implication is that he always was bad and was indeed working with Ormov during the opening sequence, and that's why they faked his death. Bond is hit with a tranquilizer dart, and when he wakes up, he and Natalya are tied up in the Tiger helicopter, and the missiles are set to blow them up. Yeah, it's another Dr. Evil moment that would drive Scott Evil crazy.
I have a gun in my room. You give me 5 seconds, I'll get it. I'll come back down here. Boom! I'll blow their brains out.
Scott, you just don't get it, do you? You don't.
And Bond makes a narrow escape, but they're quickly arrested by the Russians. And they are interrogated by the Secretary of Defense, General Mishkin. And in an early draft of the script, this was going to be General Pushkin from The Living Daylights, played by John Rhys-Davies. However, they ended up creating a new character, General Dmitry Mishkin. However, General Ormov shows up, murders Mishkin, and Bond and Natalya escape in the building's archives. But Natalya falls and Ormov captures her. And Bond gets to use his belt gadget firing grappling gun and escapes to the outside, where he finds a tank. And this leads to the central action piece of the movie, the sequence that this movie is known for. And so we get James Bond in his impeccable suit calmly driving a huge tank through the streets of St. Petersburg, destroying buildings and wreaking havoc while pursuing Ormov and Natalya, all to the music of the James Bond theme. And James Bond never loses his cool and even takes time to adjust the suit while driving the tank. And then it happens that statue of a charging horse falls on top of it. And it's a great scene, full of subtle humor, worthy of the James Bond franchise, and it's one of the most incredible action sequences in the entire franchise. Ormov and Xenia take Natalya onto Janus's train. However, Bond has rushed ahead and taken the tank to a spot on the tracks in front of 006's train. And Bond in his tank plays chicken with 006 in his train, and Xenia is totally enjoying the possibility of their train being derailed.
He's going to derail us.
Bond shoots a train and jumps out of the tank, and sure enough, the train is derailed. Bond has a drop on 006, who asks,
Why can't you just be a good boy and die?
to which Bond answers.
You first.
However, Ormov takes Natalya hostage, but Bond kills Ormov, and 006 and Xenia escape with the hidden helicopter, leaving Natalya to guess Boris's password and track their base to operations in Cuba. But the train is about to blow up, but Bond uses his laser watch to barely escape as the train explodes. Bond and Natalya head to Cuba, and Bond drives his BMW for a few seconds. Jack Wade shows up, meets them, gives them an airplane, and then he drives off in the BMW while the two search for the island. Then a missile suddenly comes out of a lake and blows them out of the sky, and Xenia appears by dropping out of a helicopter. However, Bond kills the helicopter pilot, causing Xenia to be crushed by a tree in a manner very similar to how she crushed her victims. Bond and Natalya find their main hideout underneath a large artificial lake which conceals a huge satellite dish. And this was actually filmed at the Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico. And 006 plans to aim the GoldenEye at London, causing all of London's financial and social infrastructure to shut down, basically causing London to become a Stone Age city. Meanwhile, 006 intends to hack into the Bank of London, steal a substantial amount of money, knowing that GoldenEye's electromagnetic pulse will shut down and erase all bank records, basically hiding all evidence of his crime. However, Natalya hacks into Boris's computer and causes GoldenEye to enter the atmosphere to self-destruct. Boris gets a hold of Bond's pen. Remember, 3 clicks activates the grenade, and the 4th diffuses it. Boris nervously clicks his pen, and Bond counts the clicks. Armed, dearmed, armed, dearmed, and once it is armed, he knocks the pen out of Boris's hand, activating the grenade explosion. Boris then desperately tries to get control over GoldenEye. While 007 goes to the satellite dish to clog up the gears, the 006 stops him, and they engage in a brutal fight. At first, Alex is winning, and he almost sends Bond plummeting to his death, and it's a heart-pounding, suspenseful moment. But suddenly, Bond gets the upper hand and is able to dangle Alex over the antenna of the dish before he lets him fall to his death, and it is cold-blooded. Boris is too late, GoldenEye is destroyed, and Natalya commandeers a helicopter and rescues Bond, while the satellite dish malfunctions and explodes, with the debris landing on Alec Trevelyan. Meanwhile, Boris thinks he survived the explosion, but the explosion causes some gas canisters to explode, freezing him into an ice statue. Bond and Natalya are rescued by Jack Wade and the U.S. Marines, who take them to Guantanamo Bay, where they'll get some private time, thus ending a fantastic Bond film, thrusting 007 into the modern blockbuster era. The movie premiered on 13th of November 1995 at the Radio City Music Hall, and it was the first James Bond movie to hold its premiere in New York, and only the second James Bond movie to hold its premiere in the U.S. The 1985 A View to a Kill held its premiere in San Francisco. The movie received positive reviews, and critics loved the bold new direction of the Bond franchise and credited the filmmakers for breathing new life into a languishing film franchise. Roger Ebert gave it a thumbs up and lauded the fresh new direction of Bond, while many critics cited Pierce Brosnan as an upgrade from the last Bond actor. This movie was made on a budget of $56 million, which was a record high for a James Bond movie. However, it was still a pretty modest budget for a standard Hollywood movie. That same year, Batman Forever was made for $100 million, and of course Waterworld was made for $172 million, but that was a famous disaster. The film was a huge box office hit, and GoldenEye made $106 million in the US, making it the highest box office success of any 007 film, beating Moonraker's record when unadjusted for inflation. Then it went on to make a staggering $354 million worldwide, also making it the highest money-making 007 film up to that time when unadjusted for inflation. When adjusted for inflation, Thunderball was still the #1 movie, or at least will be until Skyfall. Adjusted for inflation, GoldenEye was the 4th highest Bond movie. Today, GoldenEye is a fan favorite and is regarded as, hands down, the best of the Pierce Brosnan Bond movies, and regarded as one of the best James Bond movies, period. In 2006, IGN ranked it number 5 out of 23 films, and Entertainment Weekly ranked it number 8. Entertainment Weekly also ranked Xenia Onatopp as the 6th most memorable Bond girl, and IGN ranked Natalya as the 7th best Bond girl. In 2021, in a fan survey conducted by Yahoo, GoldenEye was ranked number 1 best Bond film, with the 2006 Casino Royale ranking number 2 and On Her Majesty's Secret Service ranking number 3. And this is also an important moment where the James Bond films took a huge step into the modern blockbuster age, and the film would usher Bond back into the big leagues. However, this movie left another very important legacy outside of the movie itself, and that is the video game movie tie-in, which actually came out a year later. GoldenEye 007, released in 1997 by Rare Limited, which came out for the Nintendo 64, was a first-person shooter similar to, at that time, Castle Wolfenstein 3D and Doom. And I remember it had a split screen where you could have 4 friends play against each other, and it was a fairly new concept at the time. and it was a huge success, probably responsible for the first-person shooters that you play today, games like Rainbow Six, Medal of Honor, Counter-Strike, and of course, Halo and Call of Duty. And furthermore, this movie finally succeeded at broadening the Bond franchise to a new, younger audience, because a whole new generation of fans, both male and female, became fans of 007 because of GoldenEye. And so it looks like James Bond franchise is off to a very good start with lots of potential. So what do they do with it? Well, we'll discuss that next time when we talk about the 1997 film Tomorrow Never Dies. Well, that ends this video, and if you enjoyed this video, check out my other videos on the James Bond franchise, the Star Trek franchise, and if you want to watch all the James Bond videos, check out this playlist right here. Well, that ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time.